World leaders are currently meeting at a donor conference aimed at supporting Syria and the region. As the talks were underway, the aerial bombardment by government forces intensified, placing intolerable pressure on civilians. Hamish De Bretton Gordon is a former commanding officer of the UK Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment and a chemical weapons advisor to NGOs as the Chief Operating Officer of Secure Bio, and he joins us now. Thank you so much for coming in.
Pleasure.
This civilian collateral damage now is quite extraordinary, and we're seeing so many civilians caught up in this, particularly this increased bombardment. How hard is it to isolate civilians from these airstrikes?
Well, it seems to be proving impossible because they're in amongst all the various forces that are fighting. And over the sort of 4 years that I've been going in and out of Syria, it's just been getting worse and worse. And one of the things I've been lobbying for in the British Parliament over the last few weeks is to try and create some sort of safe havens or safe zones to prevent this bombing. I help run 32 hospitals and clinics across Syria, particularly northern Syria, and our main hospitals have been bombed by the regime and by the Russians almost endlessly over the last 3 months. And that's creating great turmoil. Not only is all the sort of surgical work that we're doing have to be put aside, but the one sort of hope for civilians there that they can at least get medical support and some sort of aid is diminishing. And without that support and without those safe zones, just around those hospitals.
And how unusual is that for hospitals to be targeted or not to be protected?
Well, in normal conflicts, it's unheard of. It's against every sort of Geneva Convention, other legal norm. But in Syria, unfortunately, law means virtually nothing. And the Russians and Assad seem to be targeting hospitals and also bakeries and other things. I think trying to break the will of those people who are trying to oppose them. And it would appear that Putin and Assad are trying to create some sort of area for the Alawites and a route to Damascus for them to live before they're prepared to come properly to the negotiating table, as we've seen over the last few days.
And it's interesting because there is some dispute about Russia's role and whether they keep claiming that they are targeting ISIS. That's their claim. And of course the West are also running airstrikes, and they're saying, well, they could be hitting those targets too. From your experience, it is the Russian airstrikes that are doing this damage?
Oh, absolutely. Certainly in the main hospital in northwest Syria, which is only 10 miles into Syria from Turkey, where I've been many times. The Russians have bombed it 3 times in the last 5 weeks, and that is unequivocal. And it would appear that what we really need, what the international community must be doing, and Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond, the UK Foreign Secretary, is starting to talk about it, is really put pressure on Russia to stop their own bombing and stop Assad's bombing, so that we can focus on Islamic State Daesh, because that's the only thing everybody agrees with. And while this sort of is going on and the refugee crisis is getting worse, of course, we're losing the focus on Daesh, which is really what we should be focusing on to destroy at this stage.
And your negotiations with the UK government, I know in Afghanistan air drops of aid have been very successful. Is there any likelihood that they may come to the party with something like that? Well,
I think this is a really, really tangible option that could make a huge difference to Syria. At the moment, we have 17 besieged towns where people are dying in sort of medieval ways from starvation. However, with airdrops, which from the Royal Air Force or Royal Australian Air Force, these guys can drop 5-ton loads of water and food onto the size of a tennis court. So the argument that it'll fall into the wrong hands, and so what if it falls into the wrong hands? But operating out of somewhere like Cyprus using C-130 Hercules is actually, you could get tons of aid all across Syria into these besieged areas very quickly, and I think make a difference. It does, of course, mean that Putin has to stop attacking these areas, but with that done, we could make a huge difference and get a huge amount of aid in to alleviate the suffering.
Which could be a difficult thing, though, to accomplish, to get Putin to pull back. I'm really interested to tap your expertise on the chemical, biological warfare front. Do ISIS have the capability to wage biological warfare?
Well, certainly chemical warfare, and they've used chemical weapons a lot in the last sort of 18 months in both Syria and Iraq. And in fact, Foreign Secretary Julie Bishop in June last year stated that the Australian government believed that they had a chemical weapons program, and I would certainly back that up for what I've seen of Islamic State in both Syria and Iraq. So they are using it. They're using it because it's the ultimate terror weapon, and they're fighting this morbidly brilliant psychological warfare against all those who oppose them. So they're now turning towards this to create extra terror. And they've seen how successful it was when Assad used chemical weapons against the rebels in August 2013, killed 1,500. He was about to lose. He was about to be overrun. And Daesh, Islamic State, saw how successful that was. And that's why they're using it. And I think the more they get pressured, and particularly in Mosul...
And pressure to withdraw, which is what is happening in both Syria and Iraq.
Absolutely. And especially in Mosul, where I believe they're making these chemical weapons, with the big offensive about to start there, I expect we're going to see more of it. What the real threat outside Syria and Iraq is whether the cleanskins, the sleepers, the jihadis try and use it to terrorise us. Now, we've seen it in Indonesia recently with chlorine bombs. But actually, I think, we shouldn't be worrying here in Australia or the UK.
But would other countries be vulnerable, do you think?
Well, I think those without sophisticated security services and networks are more likely. And I think actually the Russians are the most likely to be attacked. The Chechens are the really nasty end of Islamic State, and they're the ones who are working on these dreadful weapons. So I'd have thought Russia was at greatest threat. But most sophisticated security services like Australia, UK and US are very well catered for this and are looking out for it. So I don't think we're going to see it here. However, in other areas, and I expect to see it more in the campaign in Syria and Iraq over the coming months, as hopefully Islamic State start to be written down and pushed out of Syria and Iraq.
Yes. Hamish, thank you very much for coming and talking about your area of expertise. Good to talk. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.